When it comes to video games, seldom are things ever removed since the idea is to add new stuff as time goes on. That's because a game's experience is developed around what already exists, and so it's usually considered too risky to take stuff away as opposed to creating new content. The only instance where it's okay to remove content is when you replace it with something of equal or ideally greater value. Simply deleting features is frowned upon in game development because it's essentially an indication of poor implementation or bad handling of whatever problems or janks stem from it. One such case that drew a lot of scrutiny was Pokemon Shield and Sword. For the uninitiated, you know how whenever there's a new Pokemon game released, there's the regional dex and then the national dex. The national dex allows you to locate and catch Pokemon from previous generations, allowing for continuity from game to game. On release, Pokemon Shield and Sword excluded over half of all Pokemon, which rightfully pissed off a lot of players, as some of the ones left out are huge favorites in the community. Garchomp, Swampert, Absol, it wasn't a very good look. Since then, they did bring in some more, but the damage was already done. Many longtime Pokemon fans became disillusioned with the franchise for Thanos snapping half of all Pokemon out of a game whose entire experience is based on catching and collecting every single one, especially considering there was no real reason for them to do so. Now fortunately, we don't have anything of equal magnitude in League of Legends. Riot never removed a champion from a game in the 12 years it's been out for, unless you count Gangplank being disabled for like 2 weeks because he died. But there is one system in the game that routinely bears witness to things being taken out: items. It isn't uncommon for items to be rotated out of circulation within League on an annual basis. For years, we've reflected on past seasons and reminisced about the memories of fun or crazy metas that took place, all of which were typically founded upon a single or combination of items. Just this past year, there was a massive overhaul of the item system, giving way to a new category of equipment known as mythic items, designed to provide champions with a meaningful first purchase and charting a build path for the rest of the game. But in light of all the different metas we've had for a lot of mythics such as Turbo Chem Tank, Gore Drinker, and Stridebreaker, the community has been divided on whether Season 11's rework was a positive change to the game or a negative one. Regardless of which side was correct, many people have expressed their longing for some of the items that were taken out for this new system. So today I want to make an episode analyzing some of the most iconic items removed from League of Legends. Just like champions, items are a point of balance. They provide you with bonus stats, some of which give extra benefits that can also be considered boosts to your stats. Now, as for what purpose they serve, the goal of an item is to be pronounced from its counterparts and serve their own distinguishable function. Each individual purchase needs to have an incentive behind it to aid the player in the best way possible for whoever or whatever they're up against. If the enemy team has a lot of healing or lifesteal champions, the most logical choice is to itemize Grievous Wounds. If your champion has an ability that sends you deep into the front lines even though you're squishy, then Zhonya's Hourglass or Guardian Angel can buy you some temporary protection. Riot's main philosophy with items is for them to create unique interactions and also respond to unique interactions, that being their motive for reworking the item system last year, alongside removing or changing those that see far too much general use. The objective was for them to create their own sense of contribution towards champion's build, whether it's through synergy or individual output. Oftentimes, the removal of an item falls into one of two reasons. Where most of them fall into is that the item itself doesn't do anything or is just too similar to an existing item. We used to have a lot of items that did nothing but give plain old stats, either that or an assortment of stats that didn't have very good synergy with each other. How many of you guys remember the Brutalizer? Cost 1337 gold, gave 25 attack damage, 10% cooldown reduction, and 15 armor pen. It was one of the most popular bruiser and assassin items because it was cheap, gave you all the offensive stats you could ask for, and nothing else. It was literally just a stat stick. I mean, it was a great stat stick, don't get me wrong. I miss Brutalizer so much, you have no idea. But it's a stat stick. It didn't even build into anything after they took it away from Black Cleaver, before removing it that same season and giving us Serrated Dirk and Caulfield's Warhammer. Other examples would be Rod of Ages. I'm sure Anivia, Rise, and Cassidy mains really missed that one. There was Will of the Ancients, which, while a very popular item for Vladimir, Mordekaiser, and sometimes Katarina back in the day, was only bought because Lifesteal is an overpowered stat and they wouldn't have gone for it otherwise. One might make a counter-argument that Rabadon's Death Cap or Manamune/Archangel Staff should be thrown away by that same logic, and while they may be considered stat sticks for doing nothing but give a bunch of ability power or mana respectively, they do have a defined purpose. Death Cap is essential for AP champs because without having significantly more ability power than physical champions do attack damage, they would fall off in the late game due to mages being forever hindered by cooldowns compared to AD carries with attack speed. Tear of the Goddess items are of course to supplement champions with steep mana costs. Even if the item did have a unique passive or active property, they could still get removed if that property is too specific or not very practical. In other words, if no one bought the item. Things like Frozen Mallet, Armwrecker, Static Shiv, Spellbinder, and Sanguine Blade. They may each have a use for a few champions or situations, but they weren't practical enough to be anything other than a fringe purchase. Thus their purpose, while there, is not distinctive enough to be used commonly. That said, not every item needs to be bought on a regular basis. There are a few legendary items in the game that you don't see all too often, such as Silvermere Dawn, but those exist because it would be far worse for the game if they weren't there, if that makes sense. Okay, basically, back in the old days, Grievous Wounds was only on Morellonomicon. That was it. Thornmail didn't give Grievous Wounds until very recently, and we've also never had Chempunk Chainsword, Mortal Reminder, or Chemtech Putrefier. Some items are in the game as a just-in-case measure, a response to things. An item like Frozen Mallet doesn't have any contingencies like that. At any point in time, there's a meta, right? Meaning some items will be more frequently picked than others. There's nothing wrong with having staples in a competitive game. In fact, that was sort of the idea behind mythic items, to give every champion in League a staple option. Ideally though, you wouldn't want a single item to get so much attention in a way that the rest of the game is played around the inclusion of said item. Items can be removed from the game if they're too popular. As an analogy, let's go to Yu-Gi-Oh! For a moment. The competitive scene over there has a forbidden and limited list, which places restrictions on the number of a type of card that can be used. If the card is forbidden, then that means it's banned. You are not allowed to use that card in any competitive format. If the card is limited, you can only use one copy of it. In the game's history, there occasionally exists what is known as a Tier 0 deck, an archetype or number of cards that sees more than like 70% pick rate in tournaments, meaning 70% of all players are running that type of deck. Naturally, this doesn't make for a very fun game state because every match devolves into figuring out how to counter that specific strategy. Usually when we think of Tier 0, we think of champions. During the Chemtag meta, Hecarim and Udyr were Tier 0 or S tier. They had an incredibly high pick ban rate and were very strong. But they can extend to items as well, and they have. Case in point, Spear of Shojin, one of the more recent Tier 0 items back in Season 9. The base stats were nice to have, but not very gold efficient given the price. However, it had by far the best single item power spike in the game, surpassing even Deathfire Grasp, another notorious one. In an average game, having the gestalt of multiple item components would grant you a noteworthy advantage over an enemy who had just the sum of its individual parts, because every completed item had a big passive. Shojin was built with a BF Sword, Kindle Gem, and Longsword, not the best build path out there, but combine them together and you got Awakened Dragon. Upon casting your ultimate, you would get 50% bonus attack speed for 6 seconds, and your basic attacks would refund 20% of the remaining cooldowns on your Q, W, and E during that time. What ended up happening was whichever top laner got their hands on Shojin first would just turbo 1v9 the game. Jax would have perma Counter-Strike, Riven turned into Katarina, Renekton would chain stun you. It was a pretty fun time. Depending on how bad the situation is, Riot would have to either nerf or rework the item to be much less gold efficient, but in some cases they would flat out remove it if the item itself is just too obnoxious to deal with. And that's exactly what happened for Banner of Command, Atma's Impaler, or I think it was Atma's Reckoning, I don't remember which one, Tracker's Knife, and Deathfire Grasp. It didn't necessarily have to be super broken. Tracker's Knife was merely a jungle version of Sightstone, but as you know, in pro play's macro-oriented environment, there was literally no reason for you to take Skirmisher Saber or Stalker's Blade. Vision was way more important than a small slow or 20% reduced damage, so they axed it. The irony in all of this is that by trying to standardize item purchasing for champions in Season 11, they've increased the risk of Tier 0 items appearing in the meta. More than half of all mythic items had 15 minutes of fame where everyone and their mothers were building the item. Just recently we had to deal with the Gore Drinker meta. Every physical melee damage dealer was taking it, and that happened several times over the course of the year with others. It seems like after one mythic gets nerfed, another just takes over and becomes Tier 0. The obvious downside to them is that it smothers out any possibility for creative freedom in build paths. If you didn't build the best item, you would be at a significant disadvantage for the rest of the game. Strangely though, there was one item in particular that was taken out that was neither purposeless nor too popular. Sword of the Occult. In case you weren't around at the time, Sword of the Occult is the attack damage equivalent of Medjai's Soul Stealer. Scoring kills or assists give you more attack damage per stack, and at a certain number of stacks you would also receive 20% bonus attack speed. Why was this item removed but not Medjai's Soul Stealer? The answer is simple. Sword of the Occult was way stronger than Medjai's proportionally speaking. See, if you take a look at AD items and compare them to AP, you get far more ability power than you do attack damage. AD mythics give you at most like 60, while AP mythics can give you 80 to 90. You may have heard the term adaptive force thrown around, such as when talking about runes. The offensive rune shards provide you with either 5.4 bonus attack damage or 9 ability power. Attack damage is generally a more useful stat because you can apply it through both auto attacks and abilities, whereas ability power is locked to just spells. And no, Nash's Tooth and Lichbane don't change that, it's still abilities. That brings us back to the argument behind Rabadon's death cap. AP items need to give more ability power to keep mages in the same power scale as AD champions towards the mid to late game since they can't use auto attacks. How this pertains to Sword of the Occult, it gives you 110 total AD at 25 stacks versus Medjay's 145 ability power, meaning Occult was way stronger. To keep both items comparable, Medjay's would have to give around 165 ability power or so. Also, AP by itself is not very good because most magic damage champions need cooldown reduction and mana early on to really get going. Medjay's and Sword of the Occult are predicated on snowballing early game. AD champions could fit Occult into their builds more comfortably than AP champions could Medjay's, so it got removed. Early gamers are also usually AD, Lee Sin, Rengar, Pantheon, Renekton, and stuff like that. We've had quite the history of removed items in League of Legends, and I can't really in good conscience say it was all that healthy either. Mostly because there is a lingering question, why did Riot choose to remove so many items instead of just keeping them there? Even if the item was unpopular or had nothing special about it, what was the problem with it existing? Why couldn't they just leave it alone? There are definitely some items that were a big blow to lose on some champions. Hextech Gunblade was a staple on those with hybrid scaling like Katarina, Akali, and Kayle. And once again, Rod of Ages was necessary for Anivia, Ryze, and Kassadin because they needed the mana and health to scale into the mid game. And neither item was particularly degenerate either. They didn't see rampant usage across too many champs, so why get rid of them? The main thing I can think of is that they're trying to reduce clutter. Let's give credit where it's due, the item shop definitely improved in terms of usability and interface. The current item selection is pretty simple. Each one has a unique function, and it's become more clear which items belong to which class. Collector is for marksmen and assassins, Sterak's is for fighters and skirmishers, Anathema's Chains is for tanks. There is much less ambiguity in items nowadays. Whenever I looked at some of the old items, it would be difficult to figure out who it was intended for. Zephyr would arguably be the most prominent example of this. Is it for AD carries, for assassins, fighters, skirmishers? It was too general and therefore not that great. However, there's a bit of a dilemma that comes from this. Riot was aiming to standardize items so that every class had an option for every situation, or at least the basic ones. Night Harvester and Luden's Tempest are essentially the same item, it's just that one is for AP champions with mana and the other is for AP champions without. There's the 5 Grievous Wound items, Guardian Angel and Zhonya's Hourglass being time stallers for AD and AP champs respectively, Sorelda's Grudge for AD champions, LDR for crit, and Void Staff for mages. If we're trying to give an item for every class though, why only in select cases and not for all? I know it was changed into Frostfire, but why did they remove Iceborne Gauntlet? It was a Spellblade item for tanks. Why did they remove Rod of Ages, a bulky option for mages when AD champions have Sterak's Gauge? That's what bothers me about their reasoning behind removing certain items. According to their rationale, neither side of the spectrum should have privileges that are withheld from the other. They went out of their way to make Grievous Wounds accessible to each class, and yet the only counter to shields is Serpent's Fang, which is exclusively locked to AD assassins and skirmishers. By the time you watch this video, we obviously have the new Magic Pen item on shields, but that should have been there since the very beginning. It's weird for them to not be fully consistent with their philosophy on item purchases because their two goals contradict one another. On one hand, they want each item to have its own unique purpose, but on the other, they want to give every class their own version of an item, so which one is it? They do deserve a pass for any item that was removed way back at the start of the game because they had no idea what they were doing at that time. But when they add an item to the game and then take it out, some champions needed those items to function, no matter how few. Actually, the only reason they had to fix Glacial Augment in preseason is because they removed Hextech GLP and Twin Shadows, the only two items that worked with Glacial. It kinda makes me wonder, did they even think that through at all? With all that said, I still stand by Season 11's item changes being a positive one for the game. There are some janks and loose ends we have to tie up, but at least to me, this is the closest in terms to balance I've seen from items. AD carries have satisfying purchases, fighters do too, mages could use some more love but they're getting it in Season 12. Assassins and tanks are doing okay too, at least now that we're out of the Gore Drinker meta. I still miss Brutalizer though, man, I want that item back so badly, it was so good! We're gonna end it off here though. I hope you found this insightful in case you were wondering about items that were removed from the game. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you left a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this, consider following me on Twitter and joining my Discord server, and lastly check out my previous discussion videos if you haven't yet. Until next time, thanks so much for watching and I hope to see you again soon. Take care.